It was a quiet suburban neighborhood where people believed they knew one another. The kind of place where neighbors waved from their driveways, where children rode bicycles along tree-lined sidewalks, and where front porch lights glowed softly long after sunset. For years, nothing about this community ever raised concern. People locked their doors out of habit, not fear. Yet hidden within this ordinary neighborhood was a secret that would remain buried for 20 years. A young woman would vanish without warning, leaving behind questions that no one could answer. Friends would search, families would hope, and investigators would struggle to understand how someone could simply disappear from a place that felt so safe. And when the truth was finally uncovered decades later, the most disturbing detail wasn't just what happened to her. It was where the answer had been hiding the entire time, quietly sitting in the house right next door. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In the spring of 1998, a young woman named Emily Carter moved into the neighborhood. Emily was 27 years old and had recently accepted a new job at a local insurance office. To her coworkers, she came across as thoughtful, organized, and full of plans for the future. She spoke often about building a stable life, saving money, and eventually buying a home of her own somewhere nearby. Emily had grown up in a small town not far away, and moving into this neighborhood felt like the beginning of something promising. Friends described her as someone who trusted people easily and believed that most individuals were good at heart. Within a few weeks, she had settled into a simple routine. She worked during the day, cooked dinner in the evening, and often spent time talking on the phone with family members who still lived back home. It was a comfortable life, the kind that seemed steady and predictable, and Emily appeared grateful for every step forward she was making. Not long after arriving, Emily became familiar with the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood. After dinner each evening, she would take a walk along the same sidewalks, passing rows of houses that looked almost identical to one another. Porch lights illuminated driveways while distant televisions flickered through living room windows. Sometimes she would pass neighbors who offered friendly greetings as they checked their mail or watered their lawns. Those evening walks became something Emily looked forward to. They allowed her to clear her mind after a long day and feel connected to the community she had just joined. People who saw her during these walks remembered her smiling politely or pausing briefly to pet a dog passing by on the sidewalk. Nothing about those nights seemed unusual. The streets were calm, traffic was light, and the entire neighborhood carried a sense of peaceful routine that made it feel like the last place anyone would expect a tragedy to begin. But one evening, everything changed. Emily finished dinner, slipped on her jacket, and stepped outside for her usual walk. The night air was cool, and the sky had already grown dark as porch lights began illuminating the street. A neighbor later recalled seeing her pass by the corner of the block around the same time she always did. After that moment, no one could say exactly where she went or what happened next. When Emily didn't return home later that night, there was no immediate alarm. Friends assumed she might have stopped somewhere along the way or decided to take a longer walk than usual. It wasn't until the following morning that concern began to grow. Emily failed to arrive at work, something her coworkers said was completely unlike her. Phone calls to her number went unanswered, and the messages left on her voicemail remained unheard throughout the day. By the afternoon, one of her coworkers drove to Emily's house to check on her. Her car was still parked in the driveway exactly where it had been the night before. The front door was locked, and the house appeared quiet. Through the window, they could see Emily's dog pacing slowly near the door, as if waiting for someone to return. Inside the home, there were no signs of struggle, no broken furniture, and no clear indication that anything violent had occurred. Yet something about the situation felt wrong. Emily had simply vanished from a routine she followed every single evening. Concerned friends contacted local police and explained that she had missed work without warning and could not be reached by phone. Officers arrived at the home shortly afterward and began asking basic questions about her schedule and recent activities. Within 2 days, the situation was officially treated as a missing person investigation. Police officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking residents whether they had seen Emily during the evening hours before she disappeared. Search teams moved through nearby wooded areas and vacant lots, hoping to find any trace that might reveal where she had gone. Flyers bearing her photograph were posted in grocery stores, gas stations, and community bulletin boards across town. Volunteers joined the search, walking along roadsides and fields while hoping for even the smallest clue. Yet every effort led back to the same unsettling conclusion. No one had seen her leave the neighborhood. No one had heard a cry for help. There were no reports of suspicious vehicles or unfamiliar faces wandering through the area that night. As the days passed, investigators began examining Emily's life more closely. They spoke with coworkers who described her as reliable and focused on her career. They interviewed friends who insisted she had no known conflicts with anyone. Her financial records showed nothing unusual, and there was no indication she had planned to leave town or disappear on her own. Each new lead ended without answers. Weeks passed, and the case slowly began to lose momentum. Detectives continued reviewing tips, but none of them pointed toward a clear explanation. The quiet suburban neighborhood returned to its usual routine, though residents carried a lingering sense of unease. People remembered seeing Emily walking those same sidewalks night after night, and the thought that she could vanish from such a familiar place left many struggling to understand what might have happened. Months turned into years, and the search for Emily Carter slowly transformed into what investigators call a cold case. Her family continued asking questions and holding on to hope that someday the truth would surface. Meanwhile, the neighborhood moved forward with daily life. New families moved into nearby homes. Children who once rode bikes on the sidewalks grew older and left for college, and seasons passed one after another. Through it all, the mystery of Emily's disappearance remained unresolved. For 2 decades, people wondered how a young woman could step outside for an ordinary evening walk and never return. What no one realized at the time was that the answer to that question had never truly left the neighborhood. It had remained there the entire time, hidden in plain sight, quietly living just a few steps away from the place Emily Carter once called home. Living just a few steps away from Emily Carter's house was a man named Daniel Harper. Daniel had been part of the neighborhood long before Emily arrived. To most residents, he appeared ordinary in every sense of the word. He was known as someone who kept to himself, someone who rarely caused problems or drew attention. His lawn was always trimmed neatly, his driveway clean, and his routines consistent. Some neighbors described him as quiet but polite, the kind of person who would offer a short greeting while collecting his mail or taking out the trash. He rarely attended neighborhood gatherings, but when he did, people remembered him standing quietly near the edge of conversations, listening more than he spoke. Nothing about Daniel Harper suggested that he was someone to worry about. In fact, he blended into the neighborhood so easily that most people barely noticed him at all. A few residents later remembered that Daniel had spoken with Emily Carter once or twice after she moved in. These interactions were brief and casual. Sometimes they exchanged greetings while passing each other near their driveways. Other times they spoke for a minute or two about ordinary things such as the weather or the neighborhood. There was nothing unusual about these conversations. They appeared no different from the polite exchanges that happened between neighbors every day across countless communities. When police officers began questioning residents after Emily disappeared, Daniel Harper was among the many people investigators spoke to. He answered their questions calmly and without hesitation. According to Daniel, the evening Emily went missing had been completely ordinary. He said he had not seen anything suspicious. He reported hearing no arguments, no screams, and no unusual activity on the street that night. Daniel explained that he had spent the evening inside his home and had gone to bed without noticing anything out of place. Investigators asked him whether he had seen any unfamiliar cars driving through the area or anyone walking along the sidewalks late at night. Daniel shook his head and repeated that he had seen nothing unusual. His responses were steady, and his demeanor appeared relaxed. Without any evidence linking him to the disappearance, detectives had no reason to pursue him further. At that stage of the investigation, there were many possibilities to consider and very few clues to guide them. Daniel Harper's statement was simply one of many collected from residents during the early days of the search. With nothing connecting him directly to the case, investigators moved on to other leads. And as weeks passed without new developments, the search for Emily Carter slowly began to lose momentum. Months turned into years, and Emily Carter's disappearance gradually became what investigators refer to as a cold case. The urgency that once surrounded the search began to fade as time passed without answers. Yet for Emily's family, the questions never disappeared. They continued to hold on to hope that someone, somewhere, might come forward with information that could explain what happened to their daughter. Each year on the anniversary of her disappearance, they gathered with friends and supporters to hold a small vigil. Candles were lit along the sidewalk as people stood quietly, remembering the young woman whose life had ended without explanation. These gatherings served as a reminder that although the investigation had slowed, the pain of uncertainty remained very real for those who loved her. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood continued moving forward. Families moved into houses that had once stood empty. Children who played in the streets during the late 1990s grew older, graduated from school, and eventually left town to begin lives of their own. Seasons passed one after another, bringing winter snow, spring rain, and long summer evenings that looked almost identical to the night Emily Carter disappeared. Over time, new residents arrived who had never even heard her name. For them, the neighborhood appeared peaceful and uneventful, just like any other quiet suburban street. Through all of these changes, one thing remained the same. Daniel Harper continued living in the house next door. He carried on with the same routines that neighbors had always seen. In winter, he shoveled snow from his driveway and sidewalk. In summer, he trimmed his lawn and watered the grass in the evenings. Occasionally, he attended block parties where neighbors gathered to share food and conversation. People greeted him the same way they greeted everyone else, with casual smiles and short conversations about everyday life. For 20 years, Daniel Harper remained part of the background of the neighborhood, another familiar face among many. Nothing about his behavior suggested that he carried a secret connected to the disappearance that had once shaken the community. To everyone around him, he was simply the quiet man who lived next door. But while life continued above ground, the truth remained hidden beneath the surface. The secret connected to Emily Carter's disappearance had never left the neighborhood. It had remained there all along, buried in a place no one had reason to examine. For 2 decades, that secret stayed undisturbed, quietly waiting for the moment when it would finally be discovered. That moment arrived in the summer of 2018. A family living down the street decided to renovate their backyard by installing a swimming pool. Early one morning, a construction crew arrived with heavy equipment and began preparing the area for excavation. Workers measured the ground carefully before starting to dig. At first, everything appeared routine, just another construction project in a neighborhood that had seen many similar improvements over the years. But as one of the workers pushed his shovel deeper into the soil, he felt the metal strike something hard beneath the surface. At first, he assumed it was a piece of buried debris or perhaps a rock. He cleared away more dirt, expecting to reveal a simple obstruction that could be removed so the work could continue. Instead, the shape that slowly appeared in the soil caused the workers to stop immediately. What they uncovered did not resemble debris or construction waste. It was a bone. Within minutes, the workers realized they were looking at human remains. The discovery was reported to authorities, and police quickly secured the backyard to prevent further disturbance of the site. Officers placed tape around the area while investigators arrived to examine the ground more carefully. Forensic specialists began a careful excavation process, slowly uncovering what had been hidden beneath the soil for decades. Piece by piece, the remains were removed and transported for analysis. News of the discovery spread quickly through the neighborhood. Residents gathered along the street, watching from a distance as investigators worked behind the police tape. Many people wondered whether the remains could be connected to Emily Carter's disappearance. The thought alone was enough to stir memories that some believed had long faded. Weeks passed as forensic testing was conducted to determine the identity of the person whose remains had been found. Finally, investigators reached a conclusion that confirmed what many feared. The remains belonged to Emily Carter. After 20 years, the missing woman had finally been found. Yet the most shocking detail had not yet been revealed. Investigators carefully studied the location where Emily's remains had been buried. The gravesite was not located deep within the woods or far from the neighborhood where she lived. Instead, it was situated in a backyard only a short distance away from her home. In fact, the burial site was located just a few feet from a familiar property line. That property belonged to Daniel Harper. When detectives realized the significance of that location, they returned to Daniel Harper's house with a new set of questions. The conversation that followed was very different from the brief interview he had given 20 years earlier. This time, investigators brought with them detailed reports from the forensic team as well as witness statements collected during the original investigation. They explained that Emily Carter's remains had been discovered near his property and asked him to account for any knowledge he might have about the area during the late 1990s. Daniel initially denied having any involvement. He insisted he had no explanation for how Emily's remains ended up there and repeated that he knew nothing about her disappearance. But as the questioning continued, detectives confronted him with inconsistencies in his earlier statements. They asked him to explain details that no longer aligned with the physical evidence investigators had uncovered. The interrogation stretched on for hours. Daniel's responses began to change as the pressure increased. Eventually, the quiet man who had lived unnoticed among his neighbors for 2 decades reached a point where he could no longer maintain his story. Daniel Harper confessed. According to his statement, the events began on the night Emily Carter disappeared. He claimed that the two had encountered each other outside their homes and began arguing. The disagreement escalated quickly, and in a moment of anger he attacked her. Realizing the consequences of what he had done, Daniel panicked. At the time, the backyard where Emily's remains were eventually discovered was undergoing renovation. Construction materials had been scattered across the area, leaving sections of ground already disturbed. Daniel decided to hide her body there, believing the soil would remain untouched and the truth would never be discovered. After burying Emily Carter, Daniel returned to his house and continued his life as if nothing had happened. In the years that followed, he lived beside neighbors who never suspected the truth. He attended neighborhood gatherings, waved to families walking down the street, and carried on with the same routines people had always seen. For 20 years, he remained in the same home, quietly living beside the place where the evidence of his crime had been hidden. When news of his confession became public, the neighborhood was stunned. Residents struggled to process the realization that the answer to a 20-year mystery had been living among them the entire time. The man many considered nothing more than a quiet neighbor had been responsible for the disappearance that once frightened their community. People remembered conversations they had shared with him over the years, small exchanges that now felt unsettling in hindsight. The thought that someone could hide such a secret while living an ordinary life left many questioning how well they truly knew the people around them. The story of Emily Carter became a powerful reminder that sometimes the truth can remain hidden for years in the most familiar places. For 2 decades, a young woman's disappearance remained unexplained while the person responsible continued living quietly nearby. When the case was finally solved, it forced an entire community to reconsider the sense of safety they once felt so certain about. What appeared to be an ordinary neighborhood had unknowingly held the answer all along, waiting for the moment when it would finally be uncovered. What do you think about this story? Could something like this happen in your neighborhood? Would you have suspected the quiet man next door? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy real stories that reveal the truth hidden within ordinary places, make sure you subscribe to Whispers in the Dark so you never miss our upcoming stories. Because the next one might leave you questioning everything you thought you understood about the world around you.